Hi.
Hi.
All right, we are live on LinkedIn. This is like our normal talking, except now we have an audience.
Other people.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Alex, thanks for joining me today on this, which is a conversation that we've been talking about for a while, which
Thank
is how do you
you.
build a data first product in the age of OpenAI? But I think we should start really quickly from how this even started and what the problem is that we were trying to solve. And so you and I met 3 years ago, and I had been facing this problem that I realized other people were facing, which is how do you get information when your child is going through something, right? Like it's not just about going to the pediatrician, but there's a lot of information needs outside of that. And you're often corroborating and you're talking to other parents. And so, what you saw actually was parents getting information from other parents on places like Facebook. And you said actually crowdsource information is really powerful. And so, my first question for you is why is that true? How do you know that? How do you know that information from a bunch of parents is something you can actually rely on?
So I think the interesting thing about believing in crowdsourced data is that my belief in it really comes from psychology experiments. We know that if you ask a bunch of people the same question, you can discover these patterns in people's answers. And that's a very, very old discipline. People have been doing it for 100 years. And uh, that like science of asking questions sort of started in psychology and anthropology and sociology, and it drifted towards uh, like business. And actually, I think what happened with things like OpenAI is it moved into the realm of computer science.
Got
So there's been this evolution, and and the fascinating thing is that that evolution has been this long-term project. It's been this project of science actually overall.
It's funny because I think one of the questions we get a lot is, well, what if there's someone who recommends this, like, Windex for a cut? And I want you to tell them what we usually say, and then we'll get into the open AI and the data stuff because I think it's really important because that's what consumers think, right? When we go on the internet and we try to get an answer, I think oftentimes we don't get good answers. And we think about one of our worst experiences and we think to ourselves, but who can I trust? And a lot of parents tell me, like, that I go to my mom friends on WhatsApp, and it's a trusted group of people that I know. And when they say trusted, they mean people whose kind of logic and decision making and information views are the same. And so, why does it work? Like, how do we make sure that the person who says Windex for a cut or something is the right remedy, is not going to show up on us?
Sure. Well, I think uh, there are a few quick answers, and then the long answer is very long. Like we spend hours. It's such an interesting. It's a big. Interesting is almost the wrong word. It's a critical problem.
Yeah.
Um, the quick answer is that first of all, things just have to be moderated, right? We can't have a platform where parents are sharing without careful moderation. And then I think the next answer is that you actually do eliminate unclean data through data cleaning processes and statistics. And what we're doing is trying to analyze what's the best answer to this question. And the cases where the statistics fail are very rare and very detectable, right? So if you have something that just huge numbers of parents believe that's wrong, then we might run into trouble. But those cases are rare. And our specialty is really the parents searching for something where there are a handful of other parents out in the universe who know the answer to that question, um, and have a lot of validity for answering that question. And we can surface that handful.
Um, One of the things that we talk about as a team is that, this product would have been much harder, if not impossible, to build if we weren't building it in the right now. And we use OpenAI. And so why don't we start as one of the things we use in our process? So tell us how OpenAI works and also tell us the strengths and weaknesses of it.
Okay. My view of OpenAI is really different than the ones I'm hearing out in the universe right now. So I think it's fun to share. I think of OpenAI as a giant map of the text out on the internet. And the way that this map was built was to start by understanding the meaning of individual words, actually even subsections of words, uh, and literally assign coordinates to those, and then see how those words group together into larger and larger phrases, and then sentences, and then paragraphs, and to start to build this understanding of meaning, which OpenAI used to create a map. So when you ask a question, it's able to find an existing example of that question. Just the way if you said, how do I get from New York City to Chicago on a map, the map has an understanding of what New York City is.
Right.
It's this place. And the
Right.
path to Chicago is this set of directions. And
Right.
what OpenAI is able to do is give you directions. And so there are a couple ways that we can use that in Sleuth. One is we actually use their underlying language models, which is not something that OpenAI innovated on at all. Actually, Google and Facebook and a bunch of other companies were working on it first. And then the other one is you can use OpenAI as a tool for translating people's questions into language that you can answer, which is like kind of like the smarter chatbot solution, which is what most of what we see people doing is smart chatbots. And that's nice, or using OpenAI directly and just putting a shell around it. But what we're really doing is saying, there's this map, and we can use this mapping tool to create our own map.
Mm-hmm.
And our map is a map of the solutions that parents use to get help for children's health conditions and symptoms and treatments and everything else.
Can you
Uh,
go a little bit into like the data that we actually do have and the importance of the context of understanding a word of a tantrum and what that could be? I think that's actually really, really interesting.
Sure. So there are two early examples we encountered. Uh, One of the first ones was parents saying that their kids couldn't sit still.
Mhm.
And in the early days of natural language processing, meaning like more than 6 years ago, can't sit still was a really hard problem because it had the word sit in the middle of it. And so if you're trying to relate that to a child having lots of energy and running around, that was very hard for computers, which made it hard for us to give people good answers. And that's just not a problem anymore. So computers can handle slang, and we can use OpenAI to OpenAI's underlying like mapping tool to analyze the sentence "can't sit still" or the phrase, and then relate that to other examples we have in our data set. Another was a parent who said that their child couldn't do crowds, right?
Mhm.
And the naive interpretation of can't do crowds is my child can't like magically create them, right? Like
Yeah.
if someone were learning language and you first use the sentence can't do crowds and they'd never heard it before, like
Yeah.
can't do X as a phrase, they would assume that it meant that you couldn't physically do that thing. So this is just a big change, and it's a huge change for us. And so then we collect data from tens of thousands of parents about their children's symptoms specifically, the solution pathway, and the outcomes. And we try to use that to expose that information to other parents. We can do it for specific geographies, for very specific symptoms, for specific age ranges, basically zeroing in enough that a parent might find something helpful. And the early results are really encouraging. Parents desperately want, and love that kind of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a big part of it. Someone you might think, but like, why is this useful? And then we look at consumer behavior and parent behavior, and we know that one of the most trusted resources is other parents. And even when I go on TikTok, like we've gone viral on TikTok a couple times for some things that we talk about, and it always astonishes me that people look for advice from people on social media. But I think that's also because it feels most accessible. right? It feels very hard to get information about anyone's health condition. Um, and I think that why, our user testing is going so well, people know they can trust this information, right? We've proven that why crowdsource information works, what we can understand in terms of the meaning of these symptoms. And now what we're trying to do is make it much more accessible and reliable. And I think that when we've talked to people in the past, sometimes if you're not on that parent journey, it's not so obvious actually why we go to each other for help. But once you're in it and once you talk to a parent, it's like night or day, right? Like when I've explained Sleuth to a parent versus a non-parent, I almost have to say nothing to the parent. And when you and I met, you weren't a parent yet,
Yeah,
right? Like
that's true.
that was
That,
you were about to be a parent, but you weren't. So I give you kudos for understanding the problem, even though you weren't yet a parent, because I think that there's a deep understanding once you do that. Um, so I'm gonna go off script a little bit, but like when you did become a parent, how did you feel about the problem? Like how did that make you rethink, or I don't know, double down on it?
I think for me, the really exciting thing about becoming a parent, yeah, it was transformative. Uh, I feel like I realized that the problems that we were tackling were much more general than the specific cases that we were dealing with. So we started out talking to parents who had faced these severe challenges. And part of our inspiration that started then and is still true was those cases where parents said, I learned this piece of information, but it took me 3 years or 5 years,
Yeah,
and it changed my child's life. And that's a really nice guiding light for a company because we know we can answer those questions well, and we know that the value is astronomical. And so if we can succeed in answering those questions frequently, that's just amazing. Like, I think that's part of our drive. But as a new parent, I discovered that the frequency of the questions was just intense. It was every few weeks, I was wondering about this concern. Like, I remember my daughter in her earliest days having all of these hiccups. And I just, like, I wanted someone to tell me how common are hiccups.
yeah,
And like every parent, I Google it and it would say, kids have lots of hiccups. And I'd be sitting there and be like, but what's lots? Like, is it
mhm,
like hours a day, every day? uh like how well, at what point should I go to the doctor for this thing? And I think parents often feel silly going to the doctor with these questions.
yeah,
um and and they wish we lived in a different era where our communities were more tightly bound, and you could go talk to 12 great grandparents and they would say, I've seen 100 kids or hundreds in our community, and a large chunk of them had lots of hiccups and they got better really quickly. And we have this experience with our, for example, our like daycare and teachers, right? Is that teachers will often say, "Don't worry about that thing." I've seen it a lot, and then it just moves on to other things. It moves on to wheezing. Your child's wheezing. Large fraction of kids do. It moves on to stuttering, which a large fraction of kids do when they're learning. It moves on to how do you get your child to eat solid food? So things that are just pure parenting. And then that sphere of common questions extends to really serious conditions where parents are fighting with things that they need help with, that are just urgent, that again thousands of other parents have been through it, but your
yeah,
doctor won't tell you that answer,
yeah, yeah,
and
and
can't and shouldn't. It's not their
no,
responsibility.
and they can't.
That's
I
why they're
mean,
bound.
there, and also just, I remember uh, my daughter has a rare situation, but her doctor literally couldn't tell me about any parents because of HIPAA, right? So there were just these built-in barriers to that information. But going back to OpenAI and this idea of trying to where people's problems and information needs are, what are the strengths and weaknesses? And then what does it mean for data first products like ours?
Sure. So I think the interesting thing about OpenAI is where the boundaries of the map end. And it's kind of the ends of what you can get out on the internet. And I think the fascinating thing for us, the critical thing for us, is that the majority of the critical information to answer most questions just doesn't exist on the internet yet. Um, and and people don't feel that way because the internet is this vast resource. And if, for example, people will say that OpenAI does really great at the LSAT, like the law school graduate exam, and that's not surprising because the content to answer LSAT questions is all over the internet. But the moment you ask a question like, what happens inside this other specialized sphere, and parenting, unfortunately, is not a sphere which we've treated as a thing that should be out on the internet for crazy, crazy reasons, uh, then all of a sudden there's just no answer. So I think, for example, it's interesting to use OpenAI and see those boundaries yourself. If you ask it a question about podcasts, um, I've been fascinated that actually Bard, Google's version of OpenAI, is really good at answering questions about podcast conversation, which means that they've absorbed and analyzed all of that. If you think about all of those hours of podcast conversations,
Wait. So what command do you put in?
you
Like,
can ask it a
summarize
question about
Tim
a specific
Ferriss's
podcast.
podcast for me?
Yeah, just ask it, pick any podcaster you like and ask it about
Yeah.
questions. And that's incredible. And it's this
Yeah.
amazing resource. Um, but then OpenAI can't go outside that sphere, and it can't draw thematic inferences across that sphere, right? It can't think really. It can map, right? And so,
Yeah.
and so that's actually a very different thing. Whereas people can think. And so if you ask people a solution, so like the classic early example of an application for machine learning was radiology, where the thought was this is actually image recognition, but it's a problem that's very closely related to speech analysis in the way that we approach it. And people would ask, and we knew that radiologists could analyze images, but it's kind of a repetitive task. And so the
Mm-hmm.
question became, and so it's this clear thing, but like those images that radiologists use are not out on the internet. They're like inside the databases of large hospital systems, and you have to unlock them. In
Yep.
our particular case, understanding the value of physical therapy, which is this kind of an abstract concept if you haven't gone to physical therapy for a specific problem or brought your child to physical therapy when they needed it, um,
Yep.
is this unclear thing. Um, and there's this tragedy, which sometimes is limited by the availability or cost of physical therapy. But there's this tragedy out in the universe, which is we underutilize these resources. And
Yeah.
like that goes for lots of things ending in the word therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, general therapy,
Yeah. Yep.
behavioral therapy. But people need an answer, which is also, what is it really? And how did it go for you? And more
Yeah.
interestingly, what does it look like when it's great or when it fails? Because you might try
Yeah.
your first therapist might not be a good one. Uh,
Totally.
and so we have these stories on Sleuth, and actually people find it incredibly helpful to see them.
There is this, speaking of podcasts, there is this podcast called Lost Debate, and there was a session with someone named Doug Lemov, I think. And apparently, he's really big in the education space because what he realized is that people who stepped into education reform, these people who really wanted to help, what they really needed was a playbook in the moment. When a kid was in a classroom and having a tantrum or being disruptive, like what were the tools and skills that that teacher needed to employ? And then his strategies were so effective that he then got hired for sports teams and other ones. And it now always reminds me of the importance of the tactical, right? And like,
Yeah,
where is the tactical information? And I think that's sometimes the cutoff in pediatrics and children's health, where you might get like the diagnosis, hopefully from a practitioner, but the how to and the living and the lived experience we don't get. That's not their job. They don't give it, right? But we turn to other parents. And I think that what we're trying to do is, like you say, unlock that information and make it really usable. And I obviously find that exciting. You find that exciting. But if there was someone out there who's trying to make a data first product, like what would your suggestions be about how to do that in terms of processes, getting the right information, how to get it, how to clean it? And I know this is a huge question, but like just roughly, what would your advice be?
so Well, so this gets to your other question about why crowdsourcing, which is that the the product has to get data that actually directly addresses the question. And the only place that the answers to parents' questions exist are in the heads of other parents. Um, and that's the thing. If you phrase your question to enough parents directly and limit the range of the answer that they can provide, then you will get these frequent, incredibly consistent responses.
Can you give examples off the top of your head?
Uh, uh, so is that all? So we ask a lot about children's health journeys.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's very helpful because when you actually ask parents about what were the first signs and symptoms of something and how did you detect it, you get these answers that are different than the stuff out on the internet. And the method
Mhm.
of detection is also often different. Lots of parents can't observe things themselves because they're too close to their child. Uh,
Mhm.
and so it's someone else in their sphere who notes the issue first. Um, and similarly, that answer changes when someone has multiple children. And then that
Right.
next step of how did you find help is actually fascinating because the resources, again, extend outside the sort of clinical sphere. Often it might touch early intervention and government services. It might touch school services. And parents mention these things systematically and discuss how they approached it. Um, and getting over that edge of like, I need to take a first step is really important. And also just the frequency of parents saying, if you see this thing, then maybe you should be concerned. And the problem is that that thing that the parent sees might not be apparent ever in a clinical setting during the 15 minutes that your child is getting to meet a doctor. And so that dynamic of parents, children display this at breakfast, that could be a really important cue. And there are a lot of these really important cues that exist only in the parenting sphere. So anyway, so pick something that's important to your audience. You can gather systematic data. It has to be systematic. Or we ask the same questions of tens of thousands of parents. And then we have this sort of research loop inside our organization where, based on the early results that we get, we systematize the questions further. And then we ask more thousands of parents the same questions again. And that is incredibly powerful. And it echoes kinds of the ways that researchers work, but with a focus purely on what's most valuable to a parent who is first observing something and has a concern. And like that's our focus, which is pretty unique to Sleuth. I think that there are other ways of creating data first products that are super fascinating and depend on not just the method of gathering the data, but how you will display it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
More.
uh, so, so people uh, are incredibly good at handling data. Like it's what our brains do, but only in certain ways. So our methods of handling data are very visual and very textual. So if you
Yeah.
communicate the meaning of data in text, like a company that does this really well in the medical sphere is 23andMe, right? Is they communicate your results from their genetic tests, but they do it using text. They say this thing is very high or very common or very low or unusual or strong or looks a lot like this group. And they use words. And those words better communicate the concept than numbers. I think
That's interesting.
especially in childcare, you take all these quizzes and people give you this number and it's like your score is 86. And then like
Right.
really
Like a sensory quiz or ADHD or
what
anxiety
does
or something.
6
Yeah.
mean, right? Yeah. And then I think visually, right, it's tricky because like we use charts and people seem to sometimes like charts and sometimes they dislike charts because people don't think in charts. And so I think we also try to use things like heat maps to show that this thing is very common and this thing is unusual. But it's an enormous project of communicating stuff. Like one of my favorite examples of um, communicating numbers is a car dashboard. Um, right? Because like there's all this technical information that goes on when you're driving, um, and some of that is learned, right? Like we've learned here's what fast means and here's what slow means, but it's also
Right.
implied by the dial, right? Like,
Yeah.
and also the dial is this curve that goes like that, And there's research that actually shows that those types of curves that look like that, like the arc of a dial in a car, are easier for people to read and more natural and more intuitive. And like
I can see that.
for very unclear reasons. So anyway, I think the question is, what's your dashboard? And like we've even adopted the word
Yeah,
dashboard to talk about data, but like
totally.
I think it might come from cars, like cars
I like
first.
that. I mean, the metaphor we hear a lot from parents is, um, I'm in the driver's seat of my child's health, and
Yeah,
there's a moment in time when you realize it's not you don't go in thinking that as a parent, actually, I think most people. I think they mostly think the medical system is the driver's seat, and then there's a moment where you're like, "Actually, aha, I need to push." So I kind of love the idea of that dashboard and, really understanding our kids' health that way, and, when you think about Strava and Fitbit and the Apple Watch, it is kind of stunning that we don't really track our child in a way that's, relative to themselves, and, like, that's what we're trying to do too, right? Like, we're trying to say, "Other kids like your child are here, and this is your child," and that is a really, really fun UX problem, right?
it's fantastic. I think uh, I I love the set of problems that we're working on, and I think that it's that everyone talks about the dangers of doing a data first product because you have to have the data first. And in our particular case, we do have the data first. Uh, and it was a huge journey for a company to get there. And now we're sitting on all this information. And the next challenge is how do you communicate it?
Yeah,
And how do you really make it usable for someone? And those are like actually, unlike collecting the data, those are journeys of a lifetime, right? We can keep improving and just continually make it clearer and clearer and more helpful and more relevant to a person's specific trouble. But parents know this, right? The reason why they want to get answers from other parents at the playground is that they know that those other parents at the playground are in circumstances that are a little bit closer to theirs. They are in the same community, or they have access to the same pharmacy, or they, and I think that that is a strength and a weakness of the playground, because
yeah,
sometimes the best answer is actually
right.
from a child who is, uh, in a different state, in a different city, in a completely different environment. Um, but sometimes the answer is the person who's closest to you. And with data, you can answer both. But then the question is, how do you make that relevant in an interface on a phone?
Right, which is where we are now.
Yeah.
Um, what are your favorite or if you could whiteboard, what would you be most excited about for OpenAI? Not for us, but just kind of
Okay.
in general, for a consumer product.
Wow. So, um, it's going to be hard to give you a coherent, complete answer, but I'll start
It's
with
okay.
random
Tell me what
things.
you got.
Um, I think that that podcast example really interests me because uh, the next level of using OpenAI is to use it to summarize stuff. And then if you're making a data first product, to do data analysis of those summaries. Because OpenAI can't do it itself. A human still has to do that. But think of a podcast that you love and the themes inside of it. Um, I'm kind of so there's that. That's like low hanging fruit. Using OpenAI as a method of having your product engage with people, that smarter chatbot where someone can ask an
Yeah,
abstract question and then it can translate the question to something that your product can deliver. Um, is just it unlocks so many opportunities for people. I mean, think about elderly people who can easily express their question, but until now haven't necessarily been comfortable even typing their question into text, right? That barrier is
yeah,
just gone, right? They want to ask for groceries or help or, or deliveries or food or repairs. That barrier is just gone. And like, that's going to revolutionize so many things. Um, so there's that, like using OpenAI as a platform. There's this future, which I think is heavily debated right now about what's the next step, what's the potential.
mhm,
And the problem of a map like tool is that it's just so limited. Like OpenAI can't think. It can only express thoughts that someone else has already said. And really literally like when I asked it what happens when you drop a bowling ball and a violin because it's very interested in that causal answer. But the truth is, there are enough examples of people dropping bowling balls on brittle objects on the internet that they can answer that question. So it
Yeah.
seems like it's thinking.
Yeah.
So what excites me is actually, can we make OpenAI seem creative? And I have a pessimistic view of what creativity is. In some cases, I think that things that we think are creative are really just creative combinations, and I think OpenAI can do that. And so there's this potential for it to start to be creative in ways that will be jaw dropping for people in the very near future. Um, and I think that we want to believe that people are these unique, creative, like that we're special. Like it's like the, heliocentric view of the universe. It's like we wanted to believe that everything went around the planet Earth, like the geocentric view. And like we want to believe that we're super creative, and I don't actually think that you can't ask something like OpenAI to combine
Right.
two things from two spheres and be creative. And I think that you
I
can,
think we just don't want to be displaced.
yeah, we don't want to be displaced.
I think
And
it's that existential thing that comes up.
right. And actually, so we had this early feeling that computers were losing to humans when they started beating us in chess. And what really scared people was when the computers started making creative chess moves. Um, and I think the belief that computers can't start being creative in other ways on the basis of the technology that we already have is unfortunately wrong. Of
Yeah.
course they can. If they can be creative in chess, yes, it's a very scripted, very limited universe, but we also thought that about speech. And so that barrier is going to fall. And when you ask me what I'm excited about for OpenAI, it's creativity by a machine that can also communicate.
Yeah.
Not in the ways humans can. It won't be able to write a book for a very long time, um, but but will it be able to create art without a prompt that is very high standard, like something that's small, like a single digital image, or right, like already people are asking it to make jokes.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like,
Use it for bedtime stories. I mean,
yeah,
that's easy. It's super easy, but
yeah,
we have these like three recurring characters over several years, and like I don't have the bandwidth to keep thinking about what this character is doing. But we just like put the prompt in and it's like, oh, that's actually totally fine.
yeah. So that's frightening and also exciting.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, we see a lot of hype around OpenAI and ChatGPT 3. Um, there's some of it I find really confusing too. Like it feels like there's this very technocratic view to the world. And even though I consider us technologists, I don't think of myself as a technocrat because I don't think that technology can solve everything in life. I think, and the way that we are as a tech first company that is solving what I feel like is a very real problem for children and families. What are the but when I see some examples of OpenAI, it feels like a much more technocratic stance. Well, if we just slap this UI on this, then it'll solve this. And like, I find that that's hardly the case. What are you pessimistic about? Like, what's
Yeah.
frustrating you right now about the conversation about OpenAI? And I know there has to be something that frustrates you about it.
So, well, we were chatting about this informally. I really don't like the analogies to brains
Yeah,
because the way brains think are so different. Like the underlying AI relies a lot on neural networks, but the only thing that really makes a neural network is like a bad analogy to like nodes connected to
yeah,
each other, which is like also true of the carpet in my apartment, right? Like it could have just been called carpet networks. It's not really about neurons at all. And I think that that points to these limitations that make me pessimistic, which is in anything where there isn't sufficient data, OpenAI works by having tons and tons and tons of examples, or by having a problem that is adjacent to something where it has tons of examples. Um, and so we see this with Sleuth, which is if you ask OpenAI, absent our own data, to classify a child's health symptom, it's wrong a huge fraction of the time. Um,
Mhm.
and that problem is only solvable by gathering tons of data to close the gap. And
How
I
much
think that
data
that
are we
process,
talking about?
often not a lot, but like 1,000 cases of a thing. But like
Okay.
OpenAI is actually the way the neural networks are work. They're like really looking for tens of thousands or hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands, um, and we use other methods to that are less dependent on high volume, but also less flexible because we're closing the gap. Like where parents are searching in Sleuth for something that is a common problem, so we're identifying common things and we can close that gap. But OpenAI can't. And like for data science in general and machine learning, the universe outside the things for which there are tons of examples is just going to be fresh territory for a very long time. We see this with self-driving cars, right? Which just gets back to like the image recognition version of machine learning. Like
Yeah.
people wanted to believe it was an easy problem to solve. And like that one time that the line on the road, which this happens all the time in New York City, the double yellow line will just go straight into a building. Right? And like the amount, like human brains can handle that. Like my daughter can hear a sentence once, a word once, and use it in a sentence in a completely different context at 3.
Yeah.
The way that neural nets and AI and OpenAI work, they need 10,000 examples. And there aren't 10,000 examples of a double yellow line going into a building like that uh, in the entire universe of stuff it can study. But it happens several times in New York City right around me. And so the car will just drive into the building. And that's a really hard problem to solve. It just needs a different type of thinking. And so I'm pessimistic about applications that try to do that. I'm also frustrated by the volume. Like OpenAI became a fad. Um, and that fad reflects excitement, but it also reflects this like belief that OpenAI can solve problems that it won't for a very long time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that desire for people to believe that it would solve these problems is actually a really interesting sociological question to
Yeah,
me.
we want,
Like, why are
right?
we,
Going
you
off
know,
topic, we want people really want it, right? It's like the science
yeah,
fiction stories that we grew up with. Like you kind of also want an oracle. Wouldn't it be
yeah.
amazing if it existed?
Well, a friend told me that there is like something called the Bhagavad Gita AI, right? So they take these canonical texts and put it, and I think it's much deeper than just a straight search. But there was a moment there where I like went back to my studies in religion and I got really freaked out about this. I was like, I don't, there's like multiple frameworks of understanding the world that I have to compute right now when we're really trying, we feel like we're crossing limits. I think that's what OpenAI is doing for us. It feels limit crossing in a way that we think we're making a fantasy out of it. We're making narratives and things about it because it is beyond what we've ever experienced. It feels really different. I mean, honestly, I just wish it would be my personal assistant. Like, I have very simple aims. Like, just get some stuff off my plate. That's all I want. Um, so my last question is, what's the future like when we started Sleuth, even though OpenAI existed, it didn't exist for us to use in the same way, right? Like is what does this moment of where we are with AI mean for what we are going to do in the next few years and what we can do?
So Sleuth makes this kind of, I think I might have mentioned this, but deep use of OpenAI. We actually use a tool that they provide that's not in the news, which is their method of mapping words. And we use that to make sense of the data that parents provide us and create our own map. And I think that that has all this potential across all of these spheres where the data isn't currently accessible. And that's super exciting. And then I think for us specifically, to give a kind of machine learning and data e answer to this question, the there are other there are methods of navigating that machine learning provides, basically similar to the tools that computers use to play video games really well, but also are very related to mapping. And it becomes this question of when someone has a concern, what's the sequence of actions that they should take?
Mhm.
And I think the exciting thing for us and the exciting thing for parents is
Mhm.
going to this next level in sequencing solutions to parents' concerns. Like basically, actually, yeah, giving you a map, right? Like the thing about Google Maps is it's not fun if it just gave you a list of the steps you have to take. What's really fun is it's saying turn left here, now turn right,
Yeah.
and
It's
you're
I feel like
going to
it's the equivalent of a last mile problem for
yeah,
any parent that is trying to really figure out what they're supposed to do. It's like if you go to your pediatrician and you find out that your child has a speech delay and they say call a speech pathologist, that is you're still missing every single step until your child actually gets better.
yeah.
And that's missing everywhere.
Yes. So I completely agree. I think the excitement is solving the last mile problem, and I think it's helping people navigate that last mile problem. And if we can do that, we can really change the way people get answers and become a I feel like partner is too strong a word for a technology company, and everyone always wants to use it. But like uh, the thing that's in your pocket that you reach for and that you refer other people to when you find magical answers.
I say this more than I probably should to you, but I am always excited about what we're going to find in our database. Like I there's so many things people are not building a children's database as far as you and I know, right? Like Sleuth is building this database. I think there are discoveries in children's health that we will find and I sincerely hope we do because there's not a lot of work on the data side of this. Like you and I were talking to a parent on Friday and I was talking about how at some point when you're caring for your child, you cross from science into art, right? You realize in some moments you're pushing against the limits of knowledge of what we understand about kids. And that really is this like frontier where um, I'm kind of excited. I don't think people think about children's health that way. We think about maybe adult health that way and like breaking frontiers, but I don't think we think about it when it comes to children's health. And to me, there's so many frontiers, and there's this huge opening that the pandemic actually provided, where we started focusing on kids more than we ever had before. We had this narrative of like kids are really resilient, and it's like yes, kids are really resilient when, right, when they have the right supports, and just trying to understand children and their development in the modern age is something that I hope we can make a dent in, in the future. So yeah. Um, do you have any last thoughts? That was my last question. Did I not ask you anything you wanted to answer?
No, no, I think I loved the conversation and I feel like that is just 1,000% correct. I think that the fun thing about this journey is that we share this perspective so strongly, coming
Yeah,
to it from very different backgrounds. And so often I feel like you're finishing my thoughts, and I completely agree.
awesome. Thank you all for tuning in, whether you're tuning in live or you're tuning in at the recording. Both Alex and I are really accessible on LinkedIn, so please feel free to share any questions or comments with us. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.